Hello everyone. For our chemistry IC presentation, we decided to focus on microplastics in drinking water, a growing environmental, chemical, and public health concern. We will explore what microplastics are, where they come from, how they enter drinking water, how effective current treatment technology methods are at removing them, and the broader impacts on human health, the environment, society, and the economy. This presentation is brought to you by Matthew, Stephen, Benedict, and Samir. Our research question was, how efficient are conventional water treatment processes such as sand filtration at removing microplastics of varying sizes from drinking water? This question was important to us because most modern-day water treatment facilities were designed to deal with pathogens and sediments long before the creation of plastic and microplastics. As a result, it's important to understand both the strengths and limitations of current systems to identify where we can improve and if upgrades are necessary.
To start off, what are plastics? Plastics are synthesized materials made up of polymers, which are long chains of molecules made up of smaller molecules linking. Plastics are mainly used due to how they're cheap, lightweight, and durable, as well as how they have endless uses. They're also made from fossil fuels, such as crude oil and natural gases. A big con of plastics is how slow they degrade, with some plastics taking hundreds of years to decompose.
So what are microplastics exactly? Microplastics are tiny plastic particles less than 5 millimeters in diameter. These particles originate and are formed from the breakdown of larger particles over time. This is due to how environmental factors, including UV-induced oxidation, sunlight, and heat, cause plastics to be weakened and degrade over time while turning them into smaller pieces as well. Additionally, microplastics can be divided into two sections. The first one is primary, and this is the purposeful manufacturing of tiny plastic particles for the creation of products. The second one is secondary, and this is how microplastics form from the breakdown of larger microplastics into smaller pieces due to environmental weathering, as mentioned earlier.
Sources of microplastics. So here there are plastic pellets, city dust, and cosmetics. Plastic pellets are the things they use to make plastic products. It's like the clay for the pot sort of. The plastic bags and other products aren't just made directly from fossil fuels. These are very easy to lose during transportation and handling. City dust refers to a lot of microplastic sources that exist within urban communities and are blown away by wind. And cosmetics refers to tiny little microbeads you can find in cosmetic products, and they're actually banned in some parts of the world.
Other sources of microplastics include synthetic textiles and vehicle tires. Synthetic textiles refers to man-made fabrics such as polyester and nylon. They shed synthetic microfibers. Vehicle tires through overall use and abrasion that happens when you drive them.
During our research, we were surprised to learn the Don River itself carries a significant amount of pollution into Lake Ontario. Approximately 36,000 kilograms or 500 billion particles of microplastic on a yearly basis. This is equivalent to the weight of around 18 standard-sized cars. In comparison, macroplastics, or plastic content that is greater than 5 millimeters, only amass to around 160 kilograms. In addition to this, according to the Government of Ontario, water collection samples analyzed from Lake Ontario, particularly the Hamilton Harbour, Humber Bay, and Toronto Harbour, determined that as much as 6.7 million particles of plastic are present per square kilometer. Microbeads, a form of microplastic, are responsible for roughly 14% of microplastic pollution in the collected samples.
The next thing that I'll be talking about are the pathways for microplastics. To start, the first one I'll be talking about is road runoff. Road runoff is the wear and tear of tires and the road itself, which is carried by rain, water, and storms into the environment. The second one is wind transfer, and as the name suggests, is the transfer of microplastics and plastics as a result of the wind carrying them around for long distances and ending up in the environment. The third one is wastewater treatment, and as microplastics enter this process, they could sometimes bypass wastewater treatment filtration and go back into the environment. The fourth one is marine activities, and in this situation, we're going to be focusing on fishing. And this includes both mass fishing and recreational fishing, as in both scenarios, equipment like lures and nets are often either dumped or lost, causing them to remain in the environment and possibly even harm wildlife.
This microscopic image showcases micro and nanoplastics in drinking water from the Institute of Hydrodynamics of the Zech Academy Services.
So now we'll be talking about the treatment methods used in order to combat microplastics in drinking water. In these methods, the water usually goes through three main steps. The first step is source water, and this is the raw, untreated water that is pulled from rivers and lakes in order to be purified. The second one is treatment, where the water is actually treated for the harmful bacteria and particles that may be present in the water. And then the third and final one is the actual distribution of this clean water after being purified.
The first treatment method we will be focusing on is carbon-based filtration. Carbon-based filtration utilizes both absorption and size exclusion in filtering microplastic polluted drinking water. Through absorption, both plastic particles and organic contaminants bond to the surface of the activated carbon. Size exclusion is where tiny pores within the carbon allow contaminants to enter, such as microplastics, and to be captured. Some of the limitations of this technique is how its reduced effectiveness against smaller particles smaller than 5 micrometers, aka nanoplastics.
The second process is sand filtration. This process is similar to carbon filtration due to how they both rely on mechanical straining and adsorption. In sand filtration specifically, water basically passes through sand vents and particles that are too big to fit just get trapped. There are also microplastics that bond with the sand itself as a result of the van der Waals forces, due to how microplastics get attracted to the surface of the sand even though there's enough space for them to pass through. However, there's also a setback here, as it's less effective for microplastics smaller than 20 micrometers, meaning a dangerous amount can still be ingested by humans.
Coagulation, flocculation, and sedimentation.
So this process neutralizes the negative charges of microplastics, allowing them to clump together. Then gentle mixing allows the microflocks to group together to make flocks. The flocks then sink to the bottom of the water and are removed. This process, though, is high in operating costs, and there's the disposal of the sludge and the chemical substances used to be worried about, as well as being less effective when it comes to smaller microplastics.
The fourth treatment technology that we will be discussing is referred to as magnetic separation. Magnetic separation is an innovative solution to combating microplastic pollution by taking advantage of the hydrophobic or water-fearing surface of plastics. So microplastics are modified to be made magnetic through their adhesion or coating with magnetic nanoparticles. This process allows microplastics to be removed as water flows through a treatment system utilizing a magnetic field. In addition, clumps are formed by the magnetic forces present, leading to the aggregation of microplastic content into larger units. Some advantages of this process include that it's relatively swift, it can capture particularly small microplastics, it's scalable, and environmentally friendly. However, some disadvantages include that it can cause secondary contamination because magnetic nanoparticles are constantly being reused. And also, it's affected by key water characteristics such as pH. In addition, it's not large-scale practical, it requires more steps than alternative methods, and microplastics aren't innately magnetic.
The fifth treatment method we will be focusing on is membrane filtration. Membrane filtration consists of various forms of microfiltration, ultrafiltration, and nanofiltration such as reverse osmosis. It will also use semi-permeable barriers to block certain impurities from passing through, which utilize many different membranes of increasing fineness. The main drawback of this process is how it's expensive, requires a lot of energy, and requires a lot of maintenance. As you can see in this image here, smaller pore sizes enable a greater yield of microplastic captures. Therefore, reverse osmosis is the most effective. However, ultrafiltration and nanofiltration are typically instituted in the real world.
So now that we've discussed the primary water treatment technologies, as well as some of their advantages and disadvantages, we will now explore the effectiveness of these processes. So here we have the removal efficiencies of the previous treatment technologies that we discussed. So it's important to consider that these values vary depending on the studies you look at and the sizes of microplastics used, because obviously a larger microplastic size would yield a higher removal efficiency. So for carbon-based filtration, it's generally 90%, 81% for sand filtration, and 14% for CFS. So carbon-based filtration, particularly dense activated carbon filtration, is able to remove upwards of 90% of all microplastics. And so in particular, microplastics that are 0.5 to 1 micrometers in size, and it's less effective for nanoplastics that are smaller than 1 micrometer. Sand filtration can remove 81% of all microplastics that are sized from 1 to 5 millimeters. And so it can capture most microplastics, and this is because its sand grain sizes are around 0.4 to 1.2 millimeters, and its pores are much smaller than 1 millimeter. And so as we know, they rely particularly on size exclusion to capture microplastics in water samples. However, they are less effective for microplastics that are around 10 to 20 micrometers. And surprisingly, CFS has a removal efficiency in ideal lab conditions of around 14%. However, generally, it can typically remove only 5% of all microplastics that are present in water. So, as we know, this has a very poor removal efficiency for both microplastics and nanoplastics, and for this reason, it's not effective on its own for microplastic removal, and instead it's often accompanied by other filtration systems for greater effectiveness. In addition, we have magnetic separation. So research was done using magnetic nano Fe3O4, also known as nanomagnetites, which is basically a type of iron oxide, as a coating in order to make the different microplastics and polymers magnetic. And so research basically just discovered that more than 80% of the polymers were removed from the water sample. And so magnetic separation is very efficient. However, its efficiency decreases for microplastics that are downwards of 1 micrometer in size, otherwise known as nanoplastics. And then we have membrane filtration. So membrane filtration comes in different forms like ultrafiltration and nanofiltration, as we previously discussed. And generally, it can remove over 90% of all microplastics from drinking water. However, they are expensive due to high operational costs. Nonetheless, a form of nanofiltration, which is a type of membrane filtration called reverse osmosis, is the most effective treatment process which falls into this category with a removal rate of 99.9%. So as we previously discussed, there's various types of membrane filtration, so the efficiency varies, but typically the smaller pore size types of membrane filtration like nanofiltration can capture virtually all types of microplastics that are present within water samples.
To add on, the next thing that we'll be talking about are the effects of microplastics to human health. The exact health implications of microplastic ingestion is not fully known due to how it's a new worldwide issue. However, studies highlight that they release toxins and disrupt hormones and damage the body's cells. They also damage vital components within the body, such as the brain, the kidneys, and the blood, and also cause additional health complications like heart attacks, cancer, and more.
Impact on society. These include accessibility, public health, and governance. The treatment for the water from these facilities may be expensive, which would affect who would be able to have access to it. Treatment also ensures clean drinking water free of microplastics for communities, and governance because they're the ones who are responsible for the budgets and allocations to these technologies.
Some economic effects of plastics in general are how plastics within the environment cost the global economy $19 billion annually, as well as how plastics in landfills additionally add another $13 billion. To add, microplastics and plastics affect many of these economies' main economic sources, such as tourism, agriculture, and fishing.
So now we'll be discussing how do microplastics affect the environment. Generally, plastics are seen as a growing environmental concern as they place a threat to the welfare of species, especially those living in marine ecosystems. Plastics can enter the food web by being ingested by aquatic organisms, where they cause both physical and internal harm, whether that be through blockages within internal body systems that are imperative for the function of that organism, such as the respiratory system, or chemical leaching and the release of toxic chemicals. In addition, plastics can affect soil health and act as a vector for transmission of diseases according to the UN Environmental Program. Within the food web, a process known as biomagnification occurs, where as it goes up each higher trophic level, the concentration of the toxins released by plastics increases. Additionally, bioaccumulation within individual organisms can occur, where the organism ingests that particular toxin from the plastics at a greater rate than its body can eliminate it. As a result, this can impair the growth, survival, and reproduction of organisms that are essential on Earth.
To add on, although water treatment processes help to remove microplastics from contaminated water, they still have negative effects on the environment. Processes like coagulation, flocculation, and sedimentation form sludge, which is comprised of both microplastics and chemicals. This sludge is then typically dumped in landfills, repurposed for agriculture, or even incinerated. This ultimately results in greenhouse gases to be emitted into the atmosphere and microplastics returning back into the environment, while also causing chemicals to return back into the environment, specifically as secondary contaminants.
Careers in chemistry, focusing on toxicologist. This job is about studying the effect of harmful substances, including poisons, chemicals, drugs, microplastics, etc., to living organisms. This allows there to be medicine and laws and guidelines to be put in place for safety. The average salary in Ontario is from about $71,000 to $127,000. The education requirements are for a senior's position, you would need a master's degree or a PhD. For smaller positions, you might just require a bachelor's degree.
These are the references we used for this presentation.
Thanks for listening.